Hey guys, before we start this video off, I wanted to give a huge thanks to all of you. This retrospective has hit the ground running and I have you to thank for that. In celebration, I'm planning a bit of a Q&A video, so if you guys have any questions for me about games, YouTube, video upscaling, or anything else under the sun, leave them here in the comments or tweet them to me at AvalancheJarrett. Thanks a lot, guys. As the 90s were coming to a close, it was obvious that Capcom had a hit series on their hands. If sales were anything to go by, the entire world had caught Resident Evil fever, which I'm just now realizing should have been a T-Virus joke. Man, talk about a missed opportunity. Anyways, Capcom was already raking in the cash, and letting the momentum slow down even for a second was not an option. Thus began work on another entry in this great series, and would you know it, it managed to involve itself in some developmental controversy. It seems like from this point forward we should probably just accept this as a rule. Resident Evil 3 is an odd point on the map for the series and manages to get just as many things wrong as it gets right. So without further ado, let's dive headfirst into this odd little spin-off that accidentally fell face first into becoming a full-on numbered sequel in Part 3 of the Resident Evil Retrospective. After the success of Resident Evils 1 and 2, Capcom had several RE projects in the works, and when it came to select which one of these potential games would bear the name of Resident Evil 3, Capcom chose a completely different game. Yep, Nemesis was never supposed to be a numbered RE game. In fact, it was being developed by a small, inexperienced team and being written by a guy who had almost no prior knowledge of the series. But thanks to a limited exclusivity deal with Sony and a few greased palms I'm sure, Resident Evil Nemesis had a 3 slapped on it. With its new position on the RE timeline came a few changes to its core concepts. Originally it was supposed to star an all-new character trying to escape from Raccoon City, but obviously this was a little too similar to the current king of survival horror, RE2. And thus, with the assistance of producer Shinji Mikami, Nemesis became the game we all know today. So what is that game? Well, hypothetical person asking a question, let's dive into it. Taking place before, during, and after the events of Part 2, RE3 is the story of Jill Valentine, celebrated expert unlocker / co-star of the first game, and her attempt at escaping her hometown of Raccoon City. It seems like her and Chris's return from the Spencer Mansion didn't exactly spell out the end of the Umbrella Corporation, but the repeated poor handling of potentially world-ending viruses very well may. After an outbreak of the T-Virus, the entire city has become a zombie-infested nightmare, and by teaming up with a member of Umbrella's own mercenary unit, Jill hopes to finally be free of all this chaos.
It was Raccoon City's last chance, and my last chance. My last escape.
Obviously wanting to eliminate any potential witnesses to their wrongdoing, Umbrella sends in a bioorganic weapon whose sole mission it is to find and kill every living member of the STARS unit. And that's pretty much it. Of course there's some more characters and a little bit of intrigue mixed in, but overall, I think Nemesis may have the most simple plot so far. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Resident Evil's strong suit has never been elaborate, complex storytelling.
I can't stop just because I'm wounded.
But can't you see those monsters are also the victims of Umbrella?
They're way better at putting us in a situation we don't want to be in, giving us the bare minimum reason for us being there, and building a serviceable trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow to the end. In this sense, RE3 feels very familiar and lives up to the series' pedigree surprisingly well. While the main premise being you're in the city, try to get out of the city probably wouldn't work in any other context, it's 3's environmental storytelling and ties to the other games that makes it worth experiencing. A die-hard Resident Evil fan will probably have a pretty big attachment to Raccoon City, and being able to explore more of this town is like letting a kid loose in a candy store, except the kid is a well-trained Special Forces member and the candy is a Legion of the Living Dead. So in this sense, I'd recommend you get real familiar with the series before diving in. And the reason for that is sort of complicated. See, the gameplay here is, well, it's probably the most mixed bag that's ever existed. And to explain that, we're going to have to start from the beginning. Nemesis mostly follows the blueprint left by parts 1 and 2, and by that I mean you explore a series of large areas that are relatively closed off at first. While solving elaborate puzzles, you slowly gain access to more map real estate and avoid or kill hundreds of virus-infected baddies. In this traditional sense, Nemesis excels with flying colors, The cornerstones of Resident Evil gameplay are handled perfectly and might even be at their best so far, especially when you consider how hard it must have been to balance the new emphasis on action. Thanks to some graphical concessions, huge groups of enemies can be on screen at once, and almost always are. To counter this, more ammo and weapons are available, but are still evenly spread out, which keeps things feeling tense. To spice things up a bit, there have been some slight alterations, like the addition of collectible gunpowders that could be mixed to create a multitude of different ammo. In the spirit of improving replayability, certain parts of the game have been randomized. Some hazards might not ever show themselves, enemy placements can change, and weapons or items might show up in different areas. Thanks to this random nature, breezing through the game by memory alone is made much more difficult. There are several points in the game where pivotal choices can be made, which often lead to completely different outcomes.
Stars.
This makes starting up a replay pretty attractive, especially since unlike RE2, this is a one-disc, one-scenario affair. Now, I know what you're thinking, and yes, I have neglected to mention the titular Nemesis as a new addition, and that's because he's not really anything new. If you've played Resident Evil 2, or at least watched the last video in the retrospective, you'll know that a giant, persistent stalker who loves to mimic the Kool-Aid Man and is programmed to eliminate the character is old news by now. Honestly, the only thing new about him is the fact that he constantly announces himself by saying, Okay, I might not be giving credit where credit's due here, but often I see real deep analysis videos on the RE series. For some reason, Nemesis chasing you into areas that were previously thought safe is always described as some kind of revolutionary step forward in the series, but the only thing that changed between these two enemies is Nemesis sometimes attacks other enemies. Sometimes. Both show up unannounced and challenge the player's idea of where they're safe, and both leave behind items and weapons for those that take the risk of fighting them. They're essentially the same exact character. So I guess the real question is, why am I such a big fan of the T-103 and not Nemesis? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that leads me right into the aspects of Resident Evil 3's gameplay that absolutely suck in my opinion.
It's finally over. Huh?
Like I said earlier, the developers wanted 3 to be way more action heavy, and also like I said before, the increase in enemy count is balanced nicely with an increased amount of firepower. Of course, Mikami wasn't going to stop while he had a good thing going, and decided to add a huge emphasis on speed and precise movement, with tank controls. Now there's no getting around it, I'm a huge supporter of tank controls. I think they're surprisingly intuitive and an essential part of survival horror. That being said, they have absolutely no place in a fast-paced action-heavy game. Trying to slightly alter your course to avoid an enemy and plan for a total change in perspective thanks to an incoming scene change is a skill most RE fans have mastered. But in my opinion, this game pushes far past the limits of what can be done with this control scheme. In the simplest terms, boss fights in this game are damn near unplayable thanks to this. Nemesis specifically can run circles around you, and your chances of avoiding his wide swings are almost non-existent. And before you start typing angrily to correct me, yes, they did implement a quick dodge move, but in the worst way possible. Hitting the shoulder button just before an attack lands will trigger a quick dodge, which would be a perfect addition if it actually worked that way. While this can get you out of some sticky situations sometimes, it just isn't reliable enough to be depended on. First off, hitting the same button you aim with to dodge attacks means one thing and one thing only. Regardless if this is your first or 14th playthrough, you will execute this dodge on accident 100 times for every one time you do it on purpose. Hell, sometimes it comes out on its own. There's been plenty of times that I've been holding R1 for several seconds to shoot, and Jill dodges an attack I never tried to dodge. What's even more annoying than that is finally thinking you have a grip on dodging in the game, and attack's just hitting you during a dodge anyways. I mean, look at this, I clearly dodged that and I still took damage. And just in case you think this is the childish screams of some Resident Evil scrub, here's me taking out one of the game's bosses using only the knife. Trust me, my Resident Evil credentials are more than up to snuff. Bottom line, this move just isn't reliable enough to be useful, and the fact that 90% of the boss fights are built around a broken mechanic means this game over screen is likely to be burned into your retinas by the end. Without a doubt, this was my worst performing playthrough in the retrospective. I mean, I typically finish an RE game with maybe 1 death under my belt and a B grade or higher, but I finished 3 with 16 saves and used all the first aid sprays I could find just to even the odds a little. Okay, so to make a long story short,
You're a bit late for that!
RE3 does traditional Resident Evil gameplay perfectly. But when a boss fight starts, there's just too many uncontrollable factors to account for. You can never really know which way the RNG is going to swing, which means being prepared with lots of ammo and health items just doesn't cut it anymore. Now, I know there's some Nemesis speedrunner in my comment section losing their shit right now, but for the rest of you, well, just try not to throw your controller at anything valuable. Okay, so after a long, specifically angry rant like that, you're probably looking to hear something positive about RE3's presentation, and you're in luck. Nemesis looks amazing. As the last game made in this engine, the devs knew exactly what knobs to tweak, and RE3 comes out as the most visually impressive game in the PS1 trilogy. Now, as usual, I have to give a huge amount of praise to the pre-rendered backgrounds on display here. Every single screen is alive with beautiful PS1 level CG detail, and it's clear that the environment designer made this game his magnum opus. Particularly, I like this area where a battle between the army and a group of BOWs took place. You just gotta love that type of environmental storytelling fan service. Character models do look a bit boxier than those found in 2, which means a reduction in geometry, but this comes at the benefit of having up to 9 or 10 zombies on screen at once. Those same zombies suffer from the same issue, but there's also a huge variety of them this time around, and their shaded textures are the most detailed you're gonna see in a PS1 RE game. This tiny reduction in character geometry is a small concession to make, and it's likely that only people seeing these two models side by side will ever notice any kind of change. Your inventory screen maintains that series look while adding some much more detailed 2D sprite art for weapons and items, and collected files now have graphical thumbnails which you can file under things no one but me really cares about. All the gameplay you've seen so far has been from the Dreamcast version. Its crisp 480 lines of resolution means much less aliasing on 3D models, and as usual, more of an emphasis on noticeable compression artifacts in the backgrounds. I would like to thank my friend Jimmy Hoppa from Import Gaming for the win here. This guy gave me the 411 on a Tokyo game shop that sells a Dreamcast SCART cable that forces VGA resolutions on most games and is an interestingly cheap alternative to the Toro VGA box. I'm not sure what kind of magic keeps this as an in-cable solution, but I'm glad I found it. Now, every RE game has a ridiculous amount of ports, and oddly enough, Nemesis has the smallest number of ports we've come across so far. As far as differences go between these ports, there's not a whole lot to talk about. The PC version, which came first, had the benefit of selectable costumes for Jill being unlocked from the get-go and re-rendered higher-res background images. Sadly, I don't have any footage of this version, but that's okay because the Dreamcast version was a straight port from the PC game and included the bonus costumes and time battle mode too. Of course, there's the GameCube version, but just like the port of Resident Evil 2 on the Cube, Nemesis is a direct port from the PS1 version, which means it plays at a much lower internal resolution. The price involved in getting good video output from the GameCube and the generally unreliable nature of Capcom PC ports in the 90s make both of these last resorts in my opinion. On the music front, Resident Evil 3 sees the return of ambient master Masami the Salami Ueda. Listen, if you're watching this, Ueda-san, feel free to use that as a new office nickname. But sadly, it doesn't quite stack up to his work in Part 2. This definitely doesn't mean he didn't put together an amazingly dark and creepy soundtrack, it just doesn't have the same impact and memorability of his previous work. And if anything, the fact that one of the weaker entries in the Resident Evil soundtrack universe is this well made and fun to listen to should tell you everything you need to know about how good Masami Ueda's work is. My particular favorites are the Hospital and City of Ruin tracks. Definitely check those out if you're into Resident Evil music. One small thing to note is a bit of a problem with the audio of the Dreamcast version, at least in my experience. I had to crank down the background music to around 60 or 70 in the options menu just so the music didn't completely drown out sound effects or voices. Now this isn't really a big deal, but I thought I'd mention it. Okay, so this has been a pretty up and down appraisal so far. I guess the big question is, do I recommend Nemesis to potential fans of the series? And the answer is a resounding yes. I know I harped on about the dodge mechanic and emphasis on quick, evasive movement, but that generally only applies to the boss fights. There's about 75% of the game where you are free to just play it as a Resident Evil game, and this is where 3 shines. The small additions may keep the gameplay feeling fresh even 3 entries in, and I really can't overstate how awesome it is exploring a ruined Raccoon City. One of my absolute favorite parts of RE2 was the very beginning segment that took place on the city's streets. Nemesis takes that area and replicates the chaotic, desolated feeling you get from exploring the streets in what could be any medium-sized US city. Of course, Resident Evil was built on enclosed, oppressive environments, and that sort of clashes with 2/3 of Part 3 taking place in a city, but these streets have been perfectly liquefied and poured through the RE filter. There's plenty of tight alleyways and contrived barriers guiding you down a strict path, but it's all done with a coat of Raccoon City paint, and maybe I'm easily pleased, but I love that. Even though I spent a solid bit of this time ripping the game a new one, I still enjoy it a lot and totally recommend it. I will, however, say this might be my least favorite entry in the classic survival horror style RE games, but being my least favorite in a series of incredible titles isn't exactly a terrible spot to be in. Like I said before, those looking to play Part 3 should probably start with the first 2 entries. This way you can really appreciate the subtle improvements like the improved combat or being able to freely walk upstairs without the use of the action button. Regardless of which version of RE3 you get your hands on, you're guaranteed a flawed but excessively entertaining time. It may not be the best that's out there, but it's the last in a great line of PS1 survival horror games, and you absolutely can't miss out on your chance to feel a combination of blind rage and pure terror from this one word. What's up guys, thanks for checking out yet another video in the retrospective. I've had a blast making these, and the fact that you guys keep coming back lets me know I have to see this series through to the end. If you want to check out the other videos in the retrospective, you can find them right here on screen or linked in the description. And if you're interested in moving beyond the realm of the numbered titles in the series, stop by my Patreon page. If I hit my funding goal there, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. But until next time, I'll see you guys right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective.